the Harris Football Podcast with your host, Christopher Harris.
Welcome. How are ya? I am Chris Harris. This is the Harris Football Podcast. Thank you very much for being here. Continued thank you for all the nice feedback on the little podcast that could. I'm about to do something that is probably pretty stupid, but hopefully it'll be fun too.
Tweet of the day.
Yeah, we're getting to the tweet of the day early. It's from K.A. Anderson, who tweets, at Harris Football. So, you're going to get a Google Voice number and actually have a hotline, right? Of course, K.A. is referring to the newly born tradition of Christopher Harris sightings across the country, inspired by my apparently drunken performance at last year's fantasy football convention in Chicago, in which I suppose I must have acted drunk on the stage, according to one Reddit poster, but I actually wasn't, so I hope I wasn't having some kind of medical episode. But anyway, in response to K.A.'s suggestion, yes, there is now a Harris Football Podcast hotline. Call in with your sightings. I know I'm out there. I know I'm bothering people somewhere. And that number is 786-529-2484. Numbers that you do not need to remember because it translates to sunk by a hug. So call Sunk by a Hug with your Christopher Harris sightings. I am truly prepared for you to do your embarrassing worst. Probably don't leave a whole lot of fantasy football questions, because if it's your team you're interested, if it's other people's teams, you're not that interested. Here's my advice. Give us a call. Get on those footy pajamas. Don't be a T-Rich balloon. And don't be a ham and egger.
Today's kickoff.
You wouldn't know it from the open, but today is auction day on the Harris Football Pod. We will be discussing your auction strategies, and we're going to do it via your questions. I solicited your feedback on Twitter at Harris Football, and I got a whole lot of questions, culled through them. Basically, I think a lot of these questions are super common among experienced and beginner auction participants, and so I think they're going to be really useful for us to sort through. The first half of the show, I'm going to pick out a few of the more basic questions and talk about those. And then later in the show, Andy Behrens of Yahoo Fantasy will come on in, and I'll ask him some of your questions as well. I think by the end of the show, we'll have some interesting theories about auction for you to proceed to your draft with. So the first question that I'll tackle is from Brady Soup, who asks if there's any particular strategy for what order to nominate players. Brady says, I like nominating the Seattle defense early to drain some competitors' money. So, this is the way an auction works. We're going around the room and nominating players in turn. You're going to pick a dollar value and a player to be bid upon, and you are certainly under no obligation to bid once you've thrown out the guy once. If the bidding goes higher, and you don't want that player, let it go, as they once said in Frozen. How do I know that? I don't think I've ever even heard that song, but somehow it's permeated my consciousness. Okay, so, I have to say that when I'm in auctions, I'm almost always nominating players I don't particularly want, but I see that there's a potential for dollars to come off the board in getting them. I'm not sure the Seattle defense is really the one that's going to do it. If I've decided, not a big Justin Forsett fan this year, which I kind of have, Justin Forsett's getting nominated. I want to see people spend. It is obviously to your advantage to have more money come off the board, especially money that you consider to be dumb money to come off the board early. So, I think, that's a way to think about your draft right away is, nominate some players that you're maybe not all that into. Next question, and actually kind of juxtaposed with the first question, is from Nicholas Tyler. Nicholas says, you're talking my language. Presumably Nicholas is a big fan of auctions, as am I. And, generally speaking, I think there's a consensus that if you have the time to spend on an auction is always going to take significantly longer than a snake draft. Yeah, there's real benefits to doing auctions. I like it because any team can get any player. In a snake draft, if you don't have a top 5 pick, you're not going to get a top 5 player, whereas in an auction, anybody can get anybody, but it is a time investment. Anyway, back to Nicholas's tweet. Wants to know if there is any value to spending money early, like the first big player out of the gate. And I don't think that that's in conflict at all with the first question about nominating players. You know, when I'm nominating, often I'm not nominating players who I particularly want, but I do think there can be really good value in being the first or maybe the second to spend big money on a player because the market isn't set yet and because scarcity is at its absolute low point in your auction. You're looking at an entirely full board of potential stars for you to own, and nobody really knows what anybody wants to spend or how anybody values the players yet, and there can be the mentality like, okay, that seems low for that player, but I don't know if I particularly want him, and I see this list of available players. There's so many other guys that I could get instead, so I'm going to let him go for, maybe a little bit cheaper. I see that sometimes in auctions. I see that, we think that the market gets set for, maybe a top 20 wide receiver by, when he goes in the first couple of players taken, and then as the wide receivers grow more scarce, you see people become a little bit more desperate and wind up establishing maybe a different plateau for wide receivers. I'll give an example. We talked about it on Tuesday's podcast with John Anik, where during the La Liga Lebowski auction, not exactly a typical auction because a lot of complicated rules and stuff, but in that auction, I think Brandon Marshall was the second player nominated, and I wound up getting him for what turned out to be a quarter of what Randall Cobb got, and I wound up getting him for $20 or $30 less than probably lesser receivers, you would generally agree. And that was because we didn't really have a sense of what people were going to spend yet, and people looked at the board and thought there were still enough good receivers left over there. So I do think it is absolutely okay. You don't always have to just sit on your stack of cash. And frankly, yesterday, John Anik said he regretted not spending his money earlier. Sometimes I think you can sneak out some bargains early in an auction. Okay, next is a group of tweets that are kind of all speaking to a core philosophical issue. And I guess I'll read you the tweets and it'll sort of lead me towards some thoughts and some theories. Luke tweets, if a site has a suggested dollar value, how much are you comfortable going over if you really want that player? Craig Congdon says, should dollar values reflect ADP? E.g., I've seen Luck and Rogers listed for $10 less than wide receivers and running backs who are actually close to them in normal ranks. Crow the 13th tweets, when a position becomes scarce, do you overpay for an average player? And Blakey McShaky, which is pretty funny, says, how do you reconcile ranks that consistently top out around $50 for top players when people routinely bid $70+ on studs? Let me start to answer these concerns by saying, there's no right way to win an auction, just like there's no right way to win a snake draft. What this still comes down to is players. And we don't have anything resembling perfect information about players by the time we draft or buy our teams. And that doesn't even come close to taking into account the random injuries that we know are going to torpedo so many fantasy seasons. To play fantasy football, any format, is to embrace the chaos. There's just going to be a ton you don't know when you're evaluating players and deciding who to take. And then you add in the auction factor in which, as I said, any team can make the decision to acquire any player, and now the market gets even murkier. And that's what it is. It's a market. The reason I've never really subscribed to the big sites who put dollar values next to players is that those are so generalized as to basically be meaningless. who cares that some algorithm is telling me that Adrian Peterson should go for $57? Exactly 57, right? The fact is that many market factors are going to conspire to congeal into Peterson's actual price in your auction.
Eye roll.
Yeah, I know. I could tell when I said it. Anyway, I mean, it's why this idea that, oh, he definitely overpaid for Peterson. I think that's a faulty idea. Yeah, definitely. We can do the math, and people do, and say that, let's just for an example, Le'Veon Bell produced 272 fantasy points last year. That was his total. And let's say in your auction he went for $50. I did the math. That's 5.4 fantasy points per dollar, and maybe that's a pretty good ratio for an expensive player, and it is. In retrospect, you're obviously trying to maximize points per dollar, but with the imperfect information you have, I'm just a fantasy football caveman. I can't understand your strange... Okay, I'm now realizing that sounds a little bit like William Shatner, and like nobody under the age of 30 is getting that reference. Anyway, with the information we have, and with pretty dumb stat projections, saying that like $50 is okay, but $55, that's stupid. You got hosed in that auction. I just don't believe in stat projections and injury projections and roster projections to the point where I can say this supposed overspend was a huge mistake. Do I want to spend less money for a good player? Yeah, of course. Everybody does in an auction. Does it make me feel good when I think I got a better player for less money than someone else did? Sure. But if the guy I picked slumps or gets hurt, my smug face goes away pretty quick. And I think a lot of people would say, it's impossible to get my smug face to go away, but whatever. All this is a long way of saying, I don't really buy that there's an overpay, at least within reason. Auctions are part science, but they're also part art. Yes, now, if you're going to tell me that your ceiling is $200 and you have two owners bidding up Peterson to $160, I'm going to say that's pretty extreme. I guess maybe it's like pornography. I know it when I see it. But the bottom line is auctions exist so you can get the players you want, and these supposedly concrete dollar values the big sites publish, in my opinion, shouldn't get in the way of that. So one more thing, and I said this in Tuesday's podcast too, is that you don't have to treat the first few players who get bought as the stake in the ground around which all their players must be drafted. One of those first questions we answered were about, spending money early to maybe sneak somebody in at what winds up being a better value than maybe lesser players wind up getting when there's scarcity later in a draft. And that's fine. I think that's good strategy sometimes to try to find a bargain early, but it also means that if you didn't find the bargain early, it's okay to spend later. Heck with it. If running backs are getting scarce and you feel like you need the last one, it's okay to go over the price of the supposedly better runner. Market conditions changed. These individual player auctions aren't taking place in a vacuum. Discipline is good in moderation because it makes sense to be able to, afford a full team, but it's not a vacuum. Scarcity gets real, and sometimes you wind up paying a bit more, and it's okay. Next question is from Ryan D., who says, how far do you go in an auction to enforce value? I like that question. Enforcing value, I think what that really means, at least what it means to me, is when you see an auction for a player about to wrap up, do you think, I bet the market will bear more? I bet if I bid it up, I can take more money off the table even if I'm not sure I necessarily want that player. I talked about on Tuesday's show about how I did that in the Lebowski auction, and I felt like I did it to pretty good effect. It's definitely a strategy that I engage in. It's not so much, oh my goodness, that number is so much lower than the number that somebody wrote down on a website. It's more, you know what? The way these guys are bidding, and given what's needed out there, given what the scarcity is, given what I see in holes in people's teams, I bet I can get more money off the board by keeping this going. This one guy seems super into him, and I bet I can get him to spend more money. Yes, I think that's a good strategy, of course. You know what the counterpoint is, which you definitely can get stuck with guys you're not sure you want. I certainly have been there before. We all have. And I think it's a viable strategy, and you sort of, again, art and science, push and pull. When's the right time to do it? When it works. It's a market system, and sometimes you misjudge the market. That's just the nature of markets, but I like it. I do it a lot. A couple more general questions before we bring in Andy Behrens. They're kind of the same question. I have one from Milpatas, who says, what's a good way to transition from snake draft keeper league to auction keeper league? And Dov Goldstein says, help, how to ascribe fair values for keepers in a league transitioning from snake to auction. I'm sure my league isn't alone. Literally, Dov, they're not alone, because I got two questions that are almost exactly the same. My answer is, there's no perfect way.
Can't do it.
Thank you, Samurai Mike. Did I get it right that time? All right, so there's no way to do this that's 100% no doubt fair for everybody. There's no retrofitted way that's going to make everyone in your league happy. The easiest way is probably to have the league look back on the previous year's snake draft and just assign dollar values for each round. You decide what the amount is, but first rounders last year now have a salary of $80. Second rounders are $65, whatever, so on. All the way down to, maybe $1 or $4 or something in the last round. Probably if you have to do that for an entire league's worth of players, you'll want to make stipulations that, players don't have to be kept if they're way too expensive, because a year later there are players who we would no longer take in the first round. And also note that you need to assign dollar values for any player who was acquired as a free agent during the season. Probably pick, a single dollar value for anybody who was a free agent acquisition. It's not the most elegant solution, but I do think it gets the job done. I can also envision more complicated ways. I'll just give you one thought. You could have everyone in your league be able to nominate, let's say, 10 players league-wide and give the dollar value that they'd be willing to pay for those players. The commissioner can then assemble a list of every player mentioned and calculate the highest bid for each player. Then each player's current owner, or owner from last year, gets the option of keeping that player at that price, basically matching that price. And if he or she doesn't want to keep that player, the player gets transferred to the owner who submitted the highest blind bid. It's difficult to do that for every player in your league because, well, then we're in full auction territory. But it's an idea to at least have some of the stars get their market set at a more reasonable, fairer market number.
Today's guest.
And today's guest is Andy Behrens of Yahoo Fantasy. Andy, how is your August ramping up?
It's busy. It's as you may know, it's a somewhat hectic time of year, but I'm happy to be back. Anything I can do to prop up this creaky old podcast.
Right, the little podcast that could needs all the help. I'm not sure if you saw the fan art that I tweeted out of my face superimposed on a train. It was haunting. Haunting my dreams.
Like in a Thomas the Tank Engine kind of?
Sort of like a cartoony, yeah, but then with my face on it, like a little engine that could, oh boy. Oh boy. I also wonder if you're aware that there's now, as of this podcast, a phone number that you can literally call to track the many random sightings that people have been having of me all around the country.
Oh, wow.
Literally, people can call, dial the number, sunk by a hug on your... on your keypad, sunk by a hug. You can literally leave a message for the podcast, and I will play it on the podcast, preferably one that explains the circumstances under which you saw me, presumably doing scurrilous things. That now has become a thing on this podcast.
So no one will ever answer the phone, right? So I can call this anytime, day or night, say whatever I like, and I don't have to worry about interacting with a person.
Humans. No humans
Thank
will be
God.
involved.
I've been waiting my whole life for a number like this.
Sunk by a hug. Okay, so I spent the first part of this show kind of railing against going into an auction with set values for players, like strictly adhering, anyway, to dollar values that the big sites like ESPN and Yahoo give out,
sure,
as if they're carved on stone tablets, and I stick by that. I don't.
Plus, I think we extended out to like a certain number of decimal places, right? Like you can be that precise in your values.
Clearly, individual player auctions don't take place in a vacuum, and there are market forces in an auction, whatever, we know all that. But I want to take a step back with you and set some parameters, because I'm also not saying, go into an auction and free love and peace, man. Like, just whatever you should spend, man. Do you go into a standard auction with any sort of proportions or ratios that tell you, okay, I want to spend this percentage of my stack on running backs, or I want to make sure I get 3 players who take up this chunk of my stack? Anything like that?
Yeah, this is so different. So I'll go into a baseball auction and I will have priced out everybody, and I try to stick to this notion of, if I've got $260 to spend, I'd like to buy $280 worth of players according to my board, right? But baseball is so much forecasting is so much more reliable, you're not totally fooling yourself with the idea that you can turn a profit at the draft or auction. Everything blows up in football, right? And you just want to get a handful of play. Look back on the best fantasy teams that you've ever bought or drafted, and you look back at what you compiled on draft day, and you're well, there's no way that thing could have won. That happens all the time.
Sure.
But you maybe get 4 or 5 guys that are big hits, couple of gems from the free agent pool throughout the year, and that's sort of how you win a football league. You stay active and all that stuff. It's not, you just can't be so precise in your player values. So I go into football auctions with almost no work done at the high end. I don't sweat, whether I think Aaron Rodgers is a $40 quarterback or a $45 quarterback, because a lot of that difference is going to come down to, freaky tip passes that become interceptions and just weird stuff. I don't get hung up, and obviously injuries rule the NFL, so I don't get hung up on the high end. So the size and shape of your league. I try to figure out what the pool of $1 players is going to be by position.
Okay.
And I try to identify the position where I really happen to like the $1 guys. And I just, my own tendency is in an auction is never to leave I'm almost never the guy with 5 spots to fill who has $25, $35 to do it and totally controls the board. I put myself in a position where my last 3 guys are dollar guys. Mm-hmm. And I want to make sure that I've filled out the rest of my roster so that those dollar guys don't kill me, so that I feel really good about it. So I would say for the most part this year I've been ending up with a bunch of cheap receivers that I happen to like. I just think the pool goes pretty deep. You get maybe 25 that you feel great about, and then you get a whole bunch that, I don't know, fall into that $1 to maybe $6 or $7 range, and I feel really good about the whole pool. So that tends to be where my dollar guys fall. But I spend most of my time, I guess, what I'm saying, on the very low end to figure out what I think those $1, $2 players are going to look like by position.
You want to tell us a couple of those dollar players that you find this year you're winding up with?
Yeah, so I guess this depends entirely on, again, your league specs. That every auction that I've been in so far is a non-standard configuration. So they're 2 quarterback, 2 tight end leagues, or they're the Lebowski league, right, where you have $912 to spend, and we keep, they don't translate very well to your standard auction pool. But I would say a lot of the guys that I've been getting for $1 or $2. I'm getting Allen Robinson. I'm getting, I got Roddy White somewhere for $2. Nobody wants the old guys. That's how I ended up with so many of them in Lebowski. But, the pool gets I've seen Charles Johnson go for $1 in smallish leagues where we have a lot of different positions to fill. It's guys like that, guys where I think there is such substantial upside. Are they going to become, I don't know, top 20? I've seen John Brown go for $2. I've landed him in a couple of places for almost no money. So, standard size league, if you're playing with 10 or 12 guys, those are some of the names that are out there at $1, and any of those guys can be a 1,000-yard receiver.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the message is there is simply you probably can't plan for Allen Robinson to be there cheap, just be ready to pounce if he is.
Right. He's just in sort of a general pool of like 10 or 12 guys that are going to be there. I feel okay, and I'd like to get 2 or 3 because I figure if I get 2 or 3, one is a total bust.
Right.
Maybe one I hit out of the park, and one is exactly what I think he'll be.
So I asked for questions on Twitter at Harris Football. People should hopefully be following by now. And I've been going through some of the questions so far in the show. Can I throw a few of them at you?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a couple right off the top that are kind of asking similar things. Lucas Bordonali says, do you strike early or wait to establish going rates for positional tiers? And Brian Kervick asks, do you try to win guys at the beginning of a positional tier, middle, or end of a tier?
You almost never want to get stuck chasing like at the end of a tier because that's how you end up spending stupid money. Like if the whole room feels like okay, we're down to I don't know who the player would be. Maybe it's DeMarco Murray or LaShawn McCoy or whatever. I'm at the end of that second tier of running backs. This is the last guy. You're always going to waste $5 there, because there'll be 2, 3, 4 people in the room who are sort of chasing the same idea.
And my point is, I'm not even sure that's a waste, right? If that's where you find yourself,
right.
That's what the market bears on that auction, and it's in the context of scarcity, and that's okay. Like I don't freak out if I have to spend the extra $5, but it's still a good point. You could be using that $5 elsewhere if you had been able to get an equivalent player earlier for less money.
Yeah, I'm normally, if we're just starting from scratch in an auction, everybody's building their team from zero. I am pretty noisy in the first half hour, so it doesn't mean that I always buy 2 or 3 people, but I am a super active bidder early. Usually within the first like 4 or 5 tosses in an auction, somebody just goes for a price that is unexpectedly low, right? Like, I think we all agree there's 5, maybe there's 6 marquee running backs this year. One of those guys is mysteriously going to go for like $41 while everybody else goes for 50 to 60, and then everybody will be scratching their head like, what the hell happened with Peterson?
Right.
It's like something like that always happens, and you want to be in a position where you're not just like head on a swivel, scoping out the room, let's get a feel for this thing, and then 20 minutes go by and all of the best running backs are gone, or, the first tier of receivers is gone. Like, you just never want that to happen. So I feel terrible if I'm 20 minutes into an auction I haven't bought a player. I mean, that never happens to me. I would feel awful if it did.
It's happened to me, but I would say I agree with you. I also was making the point earlier in the show that if and when that does happen, you get the one freaky random low guy just because everybody kind of backed off right at the same time. That's fine, and it doesn't have to be the new stake in the ground around which now all other running backs should be drafted.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
The point is, like, I don't want folks to be married to the idea of dollar ranges because it's different in every single auction.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah. And I'm sure you've talked about this, but there then comes a point where like everybody's value collapses. Like all of a sudden the room, everybody has like, 9 spots to fill, 10 spots to fill. Nobody's got more than $50, and all of a sudden you got to crumple up your sheet and just toss it because no dollar values apply anymore.
Right, and that's the point at which it starts becoming more imperative to actually throw out names you wouldn't mind having on your team,
right?
As opposed to early in the draft where sometimes you're throwing out guys just to take money off the board. So that's a good one. The Magic Fanatic, who tweets from @Fooferton_Brown, which is really very cool.
Fooferton Brown, I believe, is one of the elite fantasy academies.
Is it really? Because I thought it was a prog rock band from like the early 70s. This is maybe it was named after that prog rock band. It would be great to discuss the pros and cons of stars and scrub strategy or 0-star strategy versus a balanced attack.
Well, I hate to be the guy who defaults to it's all about your league context, but
yeah,
if you're in a 10-person league, I mean, the scrubs are awesome.
Right.
The scrubs are
it's
great.
All stars. Yeah, it's all stars.
Yeah. So you absolutely can't and that's most leagues, at least like at Yahoo. Most of them are 10, 12 teams.
Uh-huh.
They're not, you're not playing multiple tight ends. You don't have 4 flexes. You don't have 2 quarter. I mean, like, you have to go stars, and you have to just know that the dollar players are going to be really good players. And the free agent pool, those names are going to look good too. There's going to be like 5 quarterbacks where you're like, wow, I can't believe that guy isn't owned. So in a format like that, you really have to go stars scrubs, and don't even call them scrubs. Don't even think of them that way. Just be like, I'm gonna buy a first tier player at every position if I can. And then as you get, you expand out into deeper leagues, like the ones that I'm in with you, whether it's large, whether it's Lebowski, you start getting into 16 teams, or you start getting into formats where it's 12 teams, 2 quarterbacks, 3 flexes, all this stuff. I mean, now you can't end up, your roster is going to be basically defined by who the worst players are, right?
Yeah.
Like you don't want to stick yourself with, you're going to have to start a receiver who barely sees the field or only plays half snaps, and your tight end is, a guy who barely plays. It's Brent Selleck or something. Like, you don't want to stick yourself in those spots. You want to have a reasonable chance of a guy putting up decent numbers at every position every week. So that, as the league gets deeper, I'm going to think more about balancing the money a bit.
Yeah. Cool. You mentioned 2 quarterback auctions, which I'm in one, and I never cease to be amazed at how quickly they go. Nicholas Danforth basically asks us to talk about how your strategy changes when you're in a 2 quarterback league. I just noticed that maybe the prices feel okay to me, but they go fast.
Yeah, and it's I've been in a couple of these auctions actually, and the quarterbacks that get tossed early, with few exceptions, I mean, the money is silly. Like, you get $200 to spend, and you have to start 2 quarterbacks, and like Rodgers is going for $48, $49. Manning gets tossed, and he's like 45, 46, and keep in mind we still have to fill like 2, possibly 3 running back spots, like 3 receivers. Like, there's a lot to fill, and we're plunking down that number on, granted he's a first tier quarterback, but I've done what I think is fairly well in those leagues, finding a couple of, first of all, in a 2 quarterback league, I like to have, depending on the size of your bench, I like to have either 3 on the roster, or preferably you'd have 4 on the roster, right? It's a great trade chip when you get through buys and all that. But I've been shopping almost exclusively from like the 2nd and 3rd tier names, because I think the 2nd and 3rd tier names are just, I think they're awesome, actually. Like, I have no problem rolling with, whether it's Matt Ryan. Matt Ryan goes, if we just look at like Yahoo ADP, Matt Ryan is going outside like the top 7-8 rounds, something like that. Eli Manning goes late. There's guys that are proven like 4,000 yard, 30 touchdown quarterbacks who are going relatively late, or they're going in that $20 to $25 range in auctions. I so prefer doing that to spending, top dollars on guys like Rodgers, Manning, Breeze.
Right. So we're both on the same page as far as, maybe avoid the early feeding frenzy in a 2 quarterback league, and
for sure,
sort of mix and match with the rest of it. Eric Felix Peterson says he would love to hear thoughts on auction strategy in an IDP league, and I'll start it. It's the exact opposite as far as, we're talking about there's scarcity with quarterbacks and people are going to pay. You should not be paying for IDP players. Let someone else take J.J. Watt. Let someone else take Levante David. Let somebody else take Luke Kuechly. They're going to go for too much money relative to how much better they are than the other players at those positions. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would totally agree. And I've been fielding a couple of Twitter questions last couple of days from IDP drafters who are there. I mean, like, I get that last year J.J. Watt was like miles better than the next best player at his position, and some of it is like touchdown scoring, which you obviously can't count on with defensive players. That's not like a bankable stat year to year.
And in some leagues, they don't even off their offense, so they don't even count.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm getting questions from people like, should I take him 2nd round? Should I take him 3rd round? Like, normally in an IDP draft, the first 5 rounds should basically look like any other standard draft, and you should not be throwing down on defensive players that early. So there's always like 1 or 2 guys who just go overboard with it. And you're gonna have just an atrocious collection of running backs if you do that, because there's such an opportunity cost to taking a defensive player like in round 3. I mean, there's still elite receivers on the board that you will not be able to find later in the draft. And tackles are available. Usually IDP scoring is driven by simple tackles, sacks, stuff like that. That's going to be available all year, and they are stats that come into your league, come into the free agent pool constantly. Like, if you don't have enough after your draft, you will for sure be able to add it. It's like saves in baseball, basically.
John Leibowitz asks us names you like throwing out early this year and the reasons why. Who's the top guy you like throwing out early, and is it because you want to get him or because you think you can take a lot of money off the board?
Oh, yeah. I would say that the first name that I have thrown out in auctions, certainly maybe in every auction so far, has been Travis Kelce. And it's not because I dislike the player, but I don't see his path to being the number 1 or number 2 or number 3 fantasy tight end this year. To me, it is entirely the wrong offense in which to do it. They are very Jamal Charles focused anywhere near the goal line. I don't see it. I don't see him as baby Gronk. I don't see any of it. He's good to me. He's not like some clear number 2 or 3 tight end. And there's always 3 or 4 people in an auction or in any draft who want to fight over him. And that's sort of the whole point. Like you said it earlier, later in an auction, you really got to nominate players that you need or want. But early in an auction, it's kind of fun just to get money off the board. And so for me, that has been Kelce, because he always goes to a price point that I would never pay.
And for me, it's Justin Forsett for the same reasons. We talked about him in a previous podcast. We have a slightly varying opinion on him, but since I feel the way I feel about Forsett, which is, like the player, thought the tape was legit last year, but think he's a big injury risk at high usage, I'm going to throw him out. Do you think there's anything to the idea of trying to sneak? We've talked about spending early. Is there anything to the idea of sneaking through players that you actually do like and hoping that the bidding just sort of has that hiccup? I'm thinking, for me, the market seems to dislike players like Matt Forte and Joique Bell and Alfred Morris relative to where I have them. So
yeah.
Is there anything to that, do you think?
I think usually it's got to be, because we're talking about doing it when everybody's got money to spend.
That's right.
So it has to be at a point in the auction. For me, it would be relatively early. Like honestly, this has happened in almost every auction I've been in my entire life, right? Like if there's a tier of, like, the first tier of wide receivers this year, you can make really good arguments for any of like 6 players as the number 1 wide receiver. So if I feel like it's likely that if I just keep throwing those guys out, I'm going to get one of them at what I think is a bargain, then I'll do that. But I would never get so locked in on a single player that I just roll the dice and try to throw it out there, and hopefully he's the guy that nobody wants to fight me over.
Exactly, because you can't really plan on which is going to be. You said it really well earlier. Like, there's going to be 6 guys, and one of them is going to be of perplexing value, but you can't really plan on which one it is.
Yeah.
Let me wrap it up with a funny one, which is Craig Evers. How can I best annoy my fellow league mates? I like to nominate only kickers to start, but I'm wondering if I can up my game.
Yeah, no, that's really a good one. The guys who nominate kickers to start, and then the guys, there's always somebody who, there's not always somebody who does this, but sometimes we talked earlier about that pool of players that you think are going to go for $1. I've seen guys go into drafts or into auctions, and they lob out one receiver after another who should probably be a $1 receiver, and it just like it's death by 1,000 cuts, right? Because somebody in the room kind of sort of wants them, but they didn't want them at $2, and then they have to throw out that.
Yeah, I think or bidding extra dollars for defenses, bidding extra dollars for kickers. How about like in the chat room just screaming fire? You could do that.
Right.
How about like instead of we're at continually nominating like star running backs for $1.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, right. And or if you're the super annoying thing is like entering like false injury reports in draft or auction chat.
Yep.
That not cool at all.
Torn ACL.
Yes.
Just randomly throw that in there. All right, man. Well, this was great, and I appreciate your expertise. I know you do an awful lot of auctions. People can follow you on Twitter at Andy Behrens, and you are one of the best, if not the best, that I know of. And you're an amazing follow on Twitter because it's good knowledge, but it's also hilarious.
I appreciate that. Where am I right now in the world fantasy rankings? Am I top 5? Am I top 8? It doesn't really matter at this point in the season. I understand.
No, I said one of the best because I didn't want to hurt your feelings. Listen, it's outside the top 10 right now, but there are like 18 fantasy people in the world, so don't feel bad about.
It's my strength of schedule too. I understand.
That's right. Thanks for doing this, Andy. It was awesome to have you on again.
Oh, happy to do it.
That's our show. I want to mention that I was on the Audible podcast, the footballguys.com podcast with Sigmund Bloom, and we talked for a full hour about all things fantasy football. I really think you would dig it. Check it out at iTunes or wherever you get podcasts. Sigmund Bloom, really good guy, and so smart that he's actually going to be the guest on Thursday's show. So I hope you turn in for that one. And in the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful day, and thank you very much for listening.
The Harris Football Podcast's opening theme is Under the Gun by Apex Manor. The end theme is Tooth and Claw by OU Villain. Subscribe to the Harris Football Podcast on iTunes and never miss an episode.